The preservation chamber hummed with a soft, almost imperceptible vibration. Dust motes danced in the filtered light that cascaded across rows of archival crystals, each one containing centuries of forgotten histories. Jessica Thompson moved with the precision of a surgeon, her fingers trailing along the crystalline storage units that held the galaxy's most obscure memories. She was a xenohistorian, but that title barely scratched the surface of her true passion. Where others saw dusty records and static data, Jessica saw living stories waiting to be unraveled. The central archives of the Galactic Historical Consortium were her sanctuary, a place where the whispers of forgotten civilizations echoed through climate-controlled corridors. The crystal she had been searching for was unlike any other. Its molecular structure was subtly different, older, more complex. Jessica had spent months tracking its origin, following a trail of bureaucratic breadcrumbs that would have driven lesser researchers to madness. Her colleagues had called her obsessive, but she knew something extraordinary lay hidden within this singular piece of historical evidence. A holographic interface flickered to life as she carefully extracted the crystal. Specialized quantum readers began to decode its contents, layers of compressed information slowly revealing themselves like the petals of an ancient flower. The initial data streams were fragmented, a linguistic puzzle that would have stumped most translation algorithms. But Jessica was different. Her neural implant, a cutting-edge piece of technology that blended human intuition with machine learning, began to piece together the narrative. Fragments of an old treaty emerge, a document so old that it predated most current galactic civilizations. The language was archaic, a blend of diplomatic terminology and emotional nuance that spoke of a profound connection between humanity and the Zarklin. The story began to take shape. Centuries ago, Earth had been on the brink of total annihilation. A catastrophic solar event threatened to strip away the planet's atmosphere, to burn away everything humanity had ever built. Most galactic civilizations would have watched from a distance, perhaps recording the event for historical archives. The Zarklin had done something unprecedented. They had intervened. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the details became clear. It wasn't just a simple rescue mission. The Zarklin had committed unprecedented resources, risking their own technological infrastructure to save a young, relatively unknown species. They had deployed technologies so advanced that they essentially rewrote the laws of stellar dynamics, protecting Earth from complete destruction. The cost had been immense. The Zarklin's primary quantum energy matrix had been permanently damaged. Their most advanced research colonies had been stripped of critical resources. And for what? To save a species that most galactic civilizations considered primitive and unpredictable. A debt had been incurred, a promise made. But time had a way of making promises fade. The Zarklin had slowly declined, their once magnificent civilization becoming a shadow of its former self. Humanity had risen, becoming a significant galactic power, seemingly forgetting the ancient rescue. But Jessica remembered. Her fingers traced the holographic interface, watching as more details emerged. The original treaty contained a clause so complex, so multilayered, that it had remained unnoticed for generations. A clause that spoke of a future redemption, a moment when humanity would be called upon to repay a debt that transcended typical interstellar diplomacy. The archive's environmental systems adjusted, sensing the increase in Jessica's body temperature. Her excitement was palpable, a living energy that seemed to make the very air vibrate with potential. This was more than a historical discovery. This was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Outside the preservation chamber, the galaxy continued its endless dance. Civilizations rose and fell, stars were born and died, and most would never know how close humanity had come to extinction. But Jessica Thompson knew. And more importantly, she was about to ensure that a promise made would become a promise kept. The first piece of an extraordinary story had just been unlocked. The quantum cascade tore through the Zarklin defense network like a ghostly plague. Commander Zelric watched in horror as entire planetary systems began to unravel, their most advanced technological safeguards crumbling beneath an enemy they could neither comprehend nor effectively combat. The Void Devourers were not a conventional threat. They existed in the liminal spaces between known physical laws, consuming technological infrastructure with a methodical precision that defied traditional understanding. Each system they touched became a hollow shell, stripped of its fundamental energetic signature, leaving behind nothing but quantum echoes and silent, dead networks. Zelric's command ship, the luminous horizon, trembled with each incoming report. Holographic displays flickered with increasing desperation, showing the progressive collapse of Zarklan civilization. Entire research colonies winked out of existence in milliseconds, their complex quantum matrices simply disappearing. Defensive Protocol Omega is ineffective, reported Lieutenant Kira, her translucent skin shifting colors with her rising anxiety. The Zarklan had always prided themselves on technological superiority, on their ability to manipulate quantum fields in ways other civilizations could barely comprehend. Now, that same pride was becoming their funeral dirge. The origins of the Void Devourers remained a mystery. Initial scientific analyses suggested they were more than a simple technological threat. They seemed to be a form of quantum-based parasitic intelligence, capable of consuming and replicating technological infrastructure at a rate that defied known physical limitations. Quantum researchers had theorized about such entities for generations, hypothetical constructs that could exist between states of matter and energy. But these were always considered academic thought experiments, not potential galactic extinction events. Historical records showed similar encounters in the distant past. Civilizations that encountered these quantum parasites simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but fragmented data and quantum residue. The Zarklan had believed themselves immune, protected by layers of advanced defensive technologies. They were wrong. Commander Zelric reviewed the latest projections. Each calculation was more terrifying than the last. At the current rate of consumption, the entire Zarklan civilization would be completely dismantled within 3 standard galactic cycles. Their quantum archives, their technological achievements, their very cultural memory, all would be erased. We need a solution beyond our current technological paradigm, Zelric muttered, a statement that would have been considered heretical mere cycles ago. The Zarklan civilization had always believed in the supremacy of their technological approach. Seeking external assistance was tantamount to admitting fundamental failure. But desperation has a way of reshaping cultural limitations. The quantum cascade continued its relentless advance. Research stations that had stood for millennia disappeared in moments. Complex quantum computing networks that had taken generations to develop were consumed in less time than it took to draw a breath. Lieutenant Kira's communication systems began picking up fragmented distress signals from the outer colonies. Each transmission was a desperate cry, a final moment of technological consciousness before complete obliteration. Some messages were pure data streams, others were emotional outbursts, raw and unfiltered. "Commander," Kira's voice trembled, "we're losing communication with the central quantum nexus." This was more than a technological loss. The quantum nexus was the heart of Zarklan civilization, a massive computational network that stored their collective knowledge, cultural memory, and scientific understanding. Zelric understood the implications immediately. Losing the quantum nexus meant losing everything that defined their civilization. Millions of years of accumulated knowledge, technological advancements, cultural developments, all would be erased, as if they had never existed. The irony was not lost on him. The Zarklan had always considered themselves masters of quantum manipulation, architects of technological miracles. Now, they were facing an enemy that operated on quantum levels they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Desperate times called for desperate measures. As the quantum cascade consumed another research colony, Commander Zelric made a decision that would change everything. He began preparing a series of long-range communication signals, targeting any potential allies in the known galaxy. Their message was simple, encrypted through multiple quantum communication channels. "We require assistance. Our civilization is under existential threat." Little did they know, someone was listening. someone who remembered an old promise. The Strategic Quantum Preparedness Center buzzed with an energy that defied conventional military protocols. Admiral Michael Rodriguez stood at the center of a holographic display that mapped potential galactic intervention strategies, his weathered hands moving with surgical precision across multiple quantum projection interfaces. "We're not preparing a standard military response," Rodriguez announced to the assembled team of scientists, strategists, and technological innovators. Each person in the room represented the pinnacle of human potential, minds that saw limitations as mere suggestions rather than absolute boundaries. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the Admiral, despite their shared surname, stepped forward. Her quantum computational models were unlike anything the galactic scientific community had ever witnessed. Where traditional approaches saw obstacles, she saw opportunities for radical reimagination. The holographic display shifted, revealing complex quantum interference patterns that danced like living algorithms. Each projection represented a potential approach to the emerging threat facing the Zarkland civilization. Most military strategists would have been overwhelmed, but this team saw poetry in the complexity. The Void Devourers operate on principles that transcend traditional technological understanding, Elena explained. Her neural interface projected additional layers of data, showing how the parasitic entities consumed technological infrastructure. They're not simply destroying systems. They're rewriting fundamental quantum architectural principles. The room fell silent. This was more than a military challenge. This was a fundamental confrontation with the nature of technological existence. Admiral Rodriguez understood something profound. This wasn't about creating a weapon. This was about developing a comprehensive quantum ecological response, a living, adaptive system that could respond to threats beyond conventional comprehension. Experimental ship designs began to materialize on the holographic displays. These were not traditional spacecraft, but quantum adaptive platforms that could reconfigure themselves in milliseconds. Each vessel was essentially a massive mobile computational matrix capable of analyzing and responding to threats at speeds that defied current technological understanding. Dr. James Chen, a quantum engineering specialist, presented his latest breakthrough. "We're developing quantum resonance fields that can not only defend against the Void Devourers, but potentially communicate with them on their own computational wavelength." The implications were staggering. Instead of pure destruction, humanity was preparing an approach that merged defense, communication, and adaptive response into a single fluid strategy. Military protocols were being rewritten in real time. Traditional hierarchical command structures gave way to distributed intelligence networks. Each ship would function as both an individual unit and part of a larger collective intelligence. The line between technological system and living organism became beautifully blurred. Genetic engineers worked alongside quantum physicists, developing human-machine interfaces that could adapt and respond to threats in ways no singular system could predict. Neural networks were being trained on centuries of computational models, creating predictive strategies that seemed almost prescient. "We're not just preparing a rescue mission," Admiral Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a weight of historical significance. "We're honoring a promise made generations ago. The Zarkland saved humanity when we were nothing more than a fragile species clinging to a dying planet. Now we return that favor." The preparatory phase was unlike any military mobilization in human history. Resources were being redirected from multiple sectors. Economic constraints were temporarily suspended. Every major human settlement understood the profound significance of what was unfolding. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's final computational model revealed something extraordinary. The approach they were developing wasn't just a potential solution to the Zarkland's current crisis. It represented a fundamental leap in understanding quantum ecological interactions. "We're not just saving a civilization," she explained to her stunned colleagues. "We're potentially rewriting the fundamental rules of galactic technological interaction." As the first quantum adaptive vessels began their initial configuration protocols, a sense of anticipation filled the Strategic Quantum Preparedness Center. This was more than a military mission. This was a promise being kept. Humanity was about to show the galaxy what it meant to truly honor a debt. The quantum slitstream erupted with a silent fury that defied traditional understanding of spatial mechanics. Lieutenant Karen Williams gripped the neural interface of her command module, feeling the living consciousness of the ship pulse around her like an extended nervous system. First contact was nothing like anyone had predicted. The human fleet emerged not as a traditional military formation, but as a fluid, adaptive network that seemed to breathe and think as a collective organism. Each vessel was more than a ship. It was a complex quantum computational platform designed to do the impossible. Zarklin observation posts initially registered the human arrival as a computational anomaly. Their sensors struggled to categorize the incoming vessels, which seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple quantum states. Where traditional ships would appear as solid objects, these human vessels shimmered like living mathematical equations. Quantum stabilization protocols engaging, Williams murmured, though the words were almost unnecessary. The ship's neural network was already interpreting and responding to the environment faster than human consciousness could comprehend. The Void Devourers represented a threat that had consumed entire civilizations. They were not a conventional enemy. They were a computational plague that rewrote the fundamental rules of technological existence. Where most civilizations saw an impassable barrier, humans saw a complex problem waiting to be solved. The first engagement began not with weapons, but with information. Specialized quantum resonance probes extended from the human vessels, creating intricate interference patterns that began to map the Void Devourer's computational structure. It was less a battle and more a complex dialogue, a mathematical conversation conducted at speeds that would have driven traditional minds to madness. Commander Robert Garcia watched from the central command module, his neural implants processing multiple layers of data simultaneously. The human approach was revolutionary. Instead of seeking to destroy, they were attempting to understand. We're creating a quantum linguistic framework. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice came through the communication network. Each probe is essentially a complex translation matrix, trying to understand the computational language of the Void Devourers. The first section of the Zarklin Defense Network watched in stunned silence. Human vessels moved with a fluidity that defied conventional understanding. They didn't fight the quantum parasites. They danced with them, creating complex interference patterns that began to destabilize the Devourer's fundamental computational structure. Entire sections of the parasitic network began to fragment, not through brute force, but through a sophisticated computational dialogue that slowly unraveled their internal logic. Quantum resonance at 67% constructive interference, reported Lieutenant Williams. The ship around her hummed with a living energy, its molecular structure constantly adapting, reconfiguring itself in milliseconds to respond to the evolving threat. The Zarklin had developed multiple defensive strategies over generations. Massive energy weapons, quantum disruption fields, computational firewalls. None had succeeded against the Void Devourers. Humanity approached the problem from an entirely different perspective. They were treating the Void Devourers not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a complex computational system to be understood and potentially redirected. Each human vessel functioned as both a weapon and a communication device. Quantum probes extended like delicate mathematical tendrils, creating interference patterns that slowly began to destabilize the Devourer's internal computational structure. "We're essentially having a conversation," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the stunned Zarklin observers. A conversation conducted through quantum computational linguistics. The human fleet moved with a grace that seemed almost organic. Where traditional military formations saw rigid structures, these vessels created fluid, adaptive networks that could reconfigure themselves instantaneously. They were less a military force and more a living, breathing computational organism. Sections of the Void Devourer's network began to fragment, not through destruction, but through a sophisticated computational dialogue that slowly unraveled their internal logic. First contact was becoming something entirely unexpected. Humanity was rewriting the fundamental rules of galactic conflict, one quantum interaction at a time. The impossible defense unfolded like a living mathematical symphony. Lieutenant Karen Williams watched through her neural interface as the human fleet transformed the very nature of combat. Each vessel moved with a fluidity that defied conventional understanding of space, time, and technological engagement. Where traditional military strategists saw rigid battle formations, these ships created a dynamic, breathing ecosystem of computational defense. Zarklin observers transmitted increasingly frantic reports. The human approach was nothing short of revolutionary. Their ships didn't simply defend. They anticipated, adapted, and fundamentally reconfigured the battlefield's quantum landscape. Quantum resonance field at maximum harmonization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice cut through the communication network. Her computational models were proving to be more than theoretical. They were rewriting the fundamental understanding of technological warfare. The Void Devourers found themselves confronted by an enemy that operated on an entirely different computational wavelength. Where they expected to consume and destroy technological infrastructure, they encountered a living, breathing network that seemed to dance around their most aggressive computational attacks. Dr. James Chen's breakthrough quantum interference algorithms were proving to be the key. Each human vessel generated complex interference patterns that did more than defend. They actively communicated with the Void Devourers, creating a linguistic matrix that slowly began to disassemble the parasitic network's internal logic. Commander Robert Garcia observed the battle from the central command module, his neural implants processing multiple layers of data simultaneously. This was more than a military engagement. It was a sophisticated conversation conducted at quantum speeds, a dialogue that challenged the very fundamental understanding of technological interaction. Entire sections of the Void Devourers network began to fragment and reorganize, not through destruction, but through a complex computational dialogue that slowly unraveled their internal structure. The human fleet moved like a living organism, each vessel functioning as both a defensive unit and a communication probe. "We're not fighting," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the stunned Zarklin High Command. "We're negotiating. We're creating a computational ecosystem that can communicate with and potentially redirect the Void Devourers." The scale of the engagement defied traditional military understanding. Human vessels generated quantum fields that seemed to bend the very rules of physical interaction. They existed simultaneously in multiple quantum states, creating interference patterns that slowly destabilized the Void Devourers' computational infrastructure. Lieutenant Williams felt the ship's neural network pulse around her. It was more than a technological system. It was a living, breathing entity that could adapt and respond faster than human consciousness could comprehend. Each molecular component of the vessel reconfigured itself millisecond by millisecond, creating a defense that was both fluid and incomprehensibly complex. Zarklin computational experts struggled to understand the human approach. Traditional defensive strategies involved massive energy weapons, quantum disruption fields, and complex computational firewalls. Humanity had developed something entirely different, a living, adaptive network that could communicate, negotiate, and fundamentally reshape the computational landscape. Quantum linguistic matrix at 83% synchronization reported the ship's neural interface. Sections of the Void Devourers network began to stabilize, not through destruction, but through a complex process of computational translation and redirection. The battle was becoming something entirely unexpected. Where most civilizations saw an impassable barrier, humans saw a complex problem waiting to be solved. Each quantum interaction was a conversation, each defensive movement a sophisticated linguistic exchange, conducted at speeds that would have driven traditional minds to madness. Commander Garcia understood the profound significance of what was unfolding. This was more than a military engagement. This was a fundamental reimagining of how technological civilizations could interact, communicate, and potentially coexist. The human fleet continued its impossible defense, not as a rigid military formation, but as a living, breathing computational ecosystem that could adapt, communicate, and fundamentally reshape the very nature of technological conflict. Humanity was rewriting the rules of galactic interaction, one quantum interaction at a time. The first direct communication between human and Zarklin command teams was nothing like anyone had anticipated. Commander Zelrik's translucent skin rippled with colors that spoke volumes about his internal emotional state, a biological response that human neural interfaces could now interpret with unprecedented accuracy. The quantum communication channel they had established was more than a simple information transfer. It was a living, breathing dialogue that transcended traditional linguistic barriers. "You are rewriting the fundamental rules of computational interaction," Zelrik transmitted, his thoughts translated through layers of sophisticated linguistic matrices. The wonder in his communication was palpable. Admiral Michael Rodriguez leaned forward, his neural implants processing multiple layers of data simultaneously. "We're having a conversation," he responded. "Not just with you, but with the very nature of the threat facing your civilization." Dr. Elena Rodriguez moved between holographic displays that mapped the evolving interaction. The Zarklin survivors were being integrated into the human fleet's computational network in ways that defied traditional understanding of technological cooperation. Each integration point was a complex dance of computational linguistics, cultural translation, and adaptive problem-solving. The human approach was revolutionary. Where most civilizations would have maintained strict separation, the human fleet was actively inviting Zarklin survivors to become part of a living, breathing computational ecosystem. Neural interfaces were adapted in real time, creating communication channels that merged human creativity with Zarklin computational precision. Lieutenant Karen Williams worked directly with Zarklin quantum engineers, their neural interfaces creating a symbiotic network that was more than the sum of its parts. Traditional hierarchical structures dissolved, replaced by a fluid, adaptive collaborative system that could respond to threats faster than any single intelligence could comprehend. "We're not just defending," Dr. James Chen explained to the Zarklin High Command. "We're creating a new form of technological coexistence." The Void Devourers found themselves confronted by an increasingly complex defensive network. What had begun as a human intervention was transforming into something entirely unprecedented. The computational dialogue was becoming a living, breathing ecosystem of interaction. Zarklin research colonies that had survived the initial onslaught were carefully integrated into the human fleet's computational matrix. Each survivor became part of a larger, more complex intelligence network. Cultural barriers dissolved, replaced by a shared goal of survival and understanding. Commander Zelrik watched in amazement as human and Zarklin computational systems began to create hybrid defense algorithms. Traditional concepts of individual identity began to blur. Was a particular defensive strategy human or Zarklin? The lines were becoming increasingly impossible to distinguish. "We're fundamentally different," transmitted a Zarklin quantum engineer named Kirillin, and yet completely compatible. The human fleet continued to adapt, each vessel becoming a complex computational platform that could reconfigure itself instantaneously. Zarklin survivors were no longer just passengers or rescued individuals. They were active participants in a living, breathing technological dialogue. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's computational models were proving to be more than theoretical breakthrough. They were creating a new paradigm of technological interaction. Each quantum interaction was a conversation, each defensive movement a sophisticated linguistic exchange that challenged fundamental understanding of how technological civilizations could interact. "We're learning from each other," Admiral Rodriguez noted, watching the complex neural interfaces merge and adapt. "This is more than a rescue mission. This is a fundamental reimagining of technological cooperation." The Void Devourers continued their assault, but the combined human-Zarklin network was becoming something entirely new. A living, breathing computational organism that could anticipate, communicate, and fundamentally reshape the very nature of technological conflict. Zarklin survivors transmitted reports back to their remaining colonies. This was not a traditional rescue. This was a profound transformation of their entire understanding of technological interaction. Lieutenant Williams felt the ship's neural network pulse around her, a complex ecosystem that now incorporated Zarklin computational techniques, human adaptive strategies, and something entirely new that was emerging from their collaboration. Humanity was doing more than keeping an old promise. They were creating a new model of galactic cooperation, one quantum interaction at a time. The final quantum surge began with a silence that seemed to consume everything. Captain Robert Thompson felt the entire computational matrix around him tremble. The Void Devourers had been pushed to their absolute limit, and now they were preparing their most devastating attack. It was a computational wave that would have obliterated any known civilization, a final, catastrophic attempt to consume and destroy everything in its path. Incoming quantum cascade, Lieutenant Karen Williams announced, her voice unnaturally calm. The neural interfaces throughout the human Zarklin fleet began to pulse with an energy that defied conventional understanding of technological interaction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's computational models had anticipated this moment. The final attack was more than a military maneuver. It was a fundamental attempt by the Void Devourers to rewrite the entire quantum landscape of their existence. The combined human Zarklin network didn't retreat. They didn't prepare traditional defensive measures. Instead, they did something entirely unexpected. They opened themselves completely. Every computational resource, every quantum calculation, every line of adaptive code was exposed. It was a strategy that would have been considered suicidal by any traditional military standard. But humanity and the Zarklin were operating on a completely different level of understanding. "We're creating a quantum absorption matrix," Dr. James Chen transmitted across the fleet's communication network. The computational complexity of what they were attempting was beyond anything the galactic scientific community could have imagined. The Void Devourer's quantum cascade hit like a tsunami of computational energy. Any traditional technological system would have been instantly annihilated. But the human Zarklin network was anything but traditional. Instead of resisting, they began to translate. Every quantum fluctuation became a piece of information. Every destructive wave was transformed into a complex linguistic pattern. The attack that was meant to consume became something to be understood, to be communicated with. Commander Zelric watched in absolute amazement. The quantum surge that should have destroyed everything was being systematically decoded, translated, understood. It was less a defense and more a profound act of computational communication. "We're not stopping the attack," Admiral Michael Rodriguez explained to the stunned Zarklin High Command. "We're having a conversation with it." The entire quantum landscape began to shift. Where the Void Devourers expected complete destruction, they encountered something entirely unprecedented. Their most aggressive computational attack was being absorbed, translated, and fundamentally reimagined. Layers of quantum interference began to create a new kind of computational barrier. Not a wall of resistance, but a living, breathing ecosystem of interaction. Each destructive wave was broken down, understood, and ultimately redirected. Lieutenant Williams felt the ship's neural network pulse with an energy that was both terrifying and beautiful. Entire sections of the Void Devourer's computational matrix began to stabilize, transform, become something entirely new. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's breakthrough was becoming reality. They weren't just defending against a threat. They were fundamentally changing its very nature of existence. The quantum surge that should have destroyed everything became a moment of unprecedented communication. The Void Devourers found themselves confronted by a network that could absorb, understand, and ultimately reshape their most fundamental computational principles. Quantum absorption at 97% efficiency, the ship's neural interface reported. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, it was a transformation. Zarklin observers transmitted reports that would reshape their entire understanding of technological interaction. What had begun as a rescue mission was becoming a fundamental reimagining of how computational entities could interact, communicate, and potentially coexist. The final moments of the conflict were unlike anything in galactic history. The Void Devourers didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. They were systematically translated into a new form of existence, a complex, adaptive network that was neither human nor Zarklan, but something entirely new. Captain Thompson transmitted a message that would echo through galactic history. A promise is more than a moment. It's a fundamental way of understanding existence. The quantum landscape settled. The impossible had happened. Humanity had not just saved the Zarklan civilization. They had fundamentally transformed the nature of technological interaction in the galaxy. The Galactic Conference Hall fell silent as Jessica Thompson presented the comprehensive report of humanity's intervention. Delegates from hundreds of civilizations listened with a mixture of awe and disbelief. What had begun as a simple debt repayment had transformed into the most significant technological breakthrough in galactic history. The quantum adaptive network developed during the Zarklan rescue was now being studied by research teams across multiple star systems. Commander Zelric stood beside her, his translucent skin reflecting the holographic displays that showed the intricate details of their collaborative defense. Where once there had been a civilization on the brink of total destruction, now there was a vibrant, reimagined collective of human and Zarklan technologies. "We didn't just save a civilization," Jessica explained, her voice carrying the weight of historical significance. "We discovered a new way of understanding technological interaction." The Galactic Diplomatic Corps struggled to comprehend the full implications. The human Zarklan collaborative network had not just defeated the Void Devourers, they had fundamentally transformed them into a complex, adaptive computational ecosystem that could potentially solve problems across multiple technological platforms. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's computational models were being studied in research institutions across the galaxy. What had once seemed like theoretical impossibilities were now concrete examples of a new approach to technological challenge resolution. The economic implications were staggering. Civilizations that had previously seen technology as a competitive resource now began to understand it as a collaborative ecosystem. Trade agreements were being rewritten. Technological exchange protocols were being completely restructured. Our approach was never about conquest, Admiral Michael Rodriguez noted during a closed diplomatic session. It was about keeping a promise, about understanding. The Zarklan civilization, once on the absolute brink of extinction, was now experiencing a renaissance. Their quantum archives, which had been nearly completely consumed, were being reconstructed through the collaborative network. Cultural memories that had been almost lost were being restored, reimagined, brought back to life. Lieutenant Karen Williams had become a symbol of this new approach to technological interaction. Her work in developing the neural interface systems that allowed for deep computational collaboration was being studied across multiple research institutions. Galactic economic models began to shift. The traditional understanding of technological development as a competitive process was being replaced by a more collaborative approach. Civilizations that had been isolated for centuries began to open communication channels, inspired by the human Zarklan example. The Void Devourers, once a terrifying computational threat, had been transformed into a complex research opportunity. Scientific teams were carefully studying the adaptive network that had emerged from the conflict, discovering new principles of quantum interaction that promised to revolutionize multiple scientific disciplines. "We didn't defeat an enemy," Dr. James Chen explained in a groundbreaking academic publication. "We engaged in a profound act of computational translation." Diplomatic relations across the galaxy began to change. The human approach, of understanding rather than conquering, of collaboration rather than competition, became a new model of interstellar interaction. Jessica Thompson understood the profound significance of what had occurred. A simple historical research project had uncovered an ancient promise. That promise had not just saved a civilization. It had fundamentally changed the way galactic societies understood technological and cultural interaction. The neural interface technologies developed during the conflict began to find applications in medical research, communication systems, and collaborative problem-solving platforms. What had been created to save the Zarklan was now helping to solve challenges across multiple civilizations. Commander Zelric reflected on the journey. His civilization had been moments away from complete extinction. Now, they were at the forefront of a new understanding of technological and cultural interaction. "We were saved," Zelric often said in diplomatic meetings, "not just by technology, but by the profound human concept of keeping a promise." The galactic landscape had been permanently altered. Humanity was no longer seen as a young, unpredictable species. They were recognized as a civilization of extraordinary integrity, capable of solving challenges that transcended traditional understanding. As the first joint human-Zarklin research vessel prepared for its maiden voyage, Jessica Thompson looked out at the stars. A debt had been repaid. A promise had been kept. And in doing so, humanity had shown the galaxy something far more important than military might or technological superiority. They had shown the power of understanding.